Welcome to Biology 50, grade 11 biology. This is your first video and I'm going to try and cover chapters 1 and just a little bit of the chapter 2 material from your text. So just a bit of an intro as to how the course works. If you picked up color-coded handouts from me, these colors make sense, and if not, you're using the files on the Moodle site. I always start with pre-reading questions, and they're in a blue booklet for the whole course. And so those questions are to be done ahead of the lesson, ahead of watching the video or coming to class, and they're basically intro questions. They're marked as done or not done, and you can hand them in person if you're in class, or you can submit them digitally. You're going to listen through any class, or this is the first lesson. And then after, there are review pages. So they're yellow in color, and these are guided study notes. And those are to be done, and you get credit for them on the chapter test. So the chapter test in this course is a little bit creative. There are write your own test and give the answers. You'll find an exemplar on the Moodle site, and with anything in this course, please ask if you have any questions. So there's labs and activities, and our first one is to go with chapter 3. So this first chunk of material should get us going and see how things go in BIOL 50. So biology is a study of living things, and so we should probably start off with deciding what it is to be alive. What is life? If that's what we're studying, what is it? And you know, there's a number of great other YouTube videos out there, and your textbook and other resources, they don't even all agree. So our textbook says there are 7 common properties. There's about 7. You might find other lists that have, say, 9 on them, or others that have like 12 or 5. These are a starting point. They are a starting point for conversation, for discussion, for debate, for thinking. Starting point for thinking. You pretend I wrote the right thing there. So in these ones, and I can make my screen just a little bit smaller so you can see all of them at the same time. It is handy to have these printed for you so you can kind of make notes as you go. So there's 7 of them in our notes. The first thing is order. And so if we're going to recognize life, and the way we recognize life is that it's highly organized, and cells are the basis of that organization. So the first thing, it's organized, and there are cells. The second thing, if we were to recognize life, reproduction. So if something's alive, it's able to make more of its own kind. And so we could talk about sexual reproduction. That's familiar for animals, plants, pollen, eggs, seeds, right? Or we could talk about asexual reproduction. And if you are a single-celled organism like an amoeba or a paramecium, you're just going to simply split in 2. That's asexual reproduction. But all living things are capable of making more of their own kind. Then third criteria, if something is to be alive, is growth and development. And so what we're talking about here is that there's some kind of consistent growth and development. So whether you're a multicellular, that's pretty obvious. You grow up and get more cells as you get bigger, or even single cellular. Both of them, single-celled, is that what that says? Sorry, are controlled by inherited DNA. And so growth and development is something of a sign of a living thing. On down the list, and we're going to apply these to some examples after I just kind of breeze through the list here. Energy processing. So anything that's alive is using chemical energy to keep it going. It might be moving, but on a cellular level, there's organ activities and chemical reactions. And so, you know, it might not move around and use energy in that way, but it is always using chemical energy to power itself and keep it alive. The next one is response to the environment. And, you know, there are things that respond to the environment that aren't alive, but Mostly what we're talking about is their ability to respond to environmental stimuli. So even a plant, a sunflower, will turn towards the sun, right? That's the kind of response to the environment. Regulation, another. An important thing of regulation is homeostasis sometimes. So that is if they keep a steady state. And humans have a lot of homeostatic controls that are part of their regulation. But again, this regulation is whatever it is to sustain life. There are some animals that don't regulate their body temperature, but they have other mechanisms that keep them alive. The last one would be evolutionary adaptations. And so this idea is that you could recognize that there are adaptations evolve over generations, and the idea of survival of the fittest. Or that doesn't necessarily mean fittest. um, it's reproductive fitness is what we're talking about. And we'll talk more about that when we get inductive. I can't talk and um, spell at the same time. Okay, so reproductive fitness, it's about how many offspring do you have, and that influences how many of your traits are out there, and that would reflect as the best suited for their environment. Greater reproductive success. So is it alive? If we were to play this game, you know, you could talk about things like a computer, your Roomba, is it alive? Those two things are not alive, but they might respond to the environment, right? They might process energy. There might be some of these criteria that would have you say, okay, well, they have some of the characteristics of life, but not all. We could talk about bread yeast. And in class, we got on the topic of sourdough starter. If you are a bread baker, baking bread is a real biological process, and yeast is alive. It has this dormant stage, but it blooms. A sourdough starter, you have to keep feeding, those kind of things. A cloud, it might have some of those you know, characteristics, but it's not alive. E. coli bacteria, it's alive. It's tiny, tiny, but it does all of these things. Algae, again, I'd say that's alive. And then this one is debatable. And so is a virus alive or not alive? And some of the other videos I linked to on the Moodle site kind of delve into this a little bit. The general consensus, I think, is that viruses are not alive. They do have a lot of these traits. They do evolve. They do respond to their environment, but the key with that is that they need a host to reproduce. And that's the big one that usually is the criteria that is compromised because they can't reproduce by themselves. They need to infect you, make more of themselves as they infect your cells, and that's how they reproduce. And so that's kind of where most people think on flu virus. But you know, honestly, these are just a set of criteria that, like I said, are a beginning point, and they're something we can think about as we move through and talk about biology. So some pretty pictures. All right. So some common themes in biology, and your textbook again does a bit of a messy job, I'd say, listing these themes. They're kind of hard to find, but I found 5 in your notebooks and also, or in your textbook, and also, you know, having immersed myself in biology, these are true. It's hard for me to get through the first few chapters even in this course without going to these things. And so I put them all on one slide so you could kind of see them in one spot. In your review pages, I suggest boiling them down to as few words as possible, because that gives you an idea of you know, how you can distill your understanding. So the first thing we're going to do is talk through them individually, and then maybe I'll come back and just highlight the key words on these. So I'll come back to this slide, or you can come back to this slide if I forget. So the first thing that we're talking about with biology and themes of biology is the levels of organization. And so it says here, novel properties emerge at each level of organization. And so basically, this is a continuum. It goes from the very, very, very small to the very, very, very big if you move up the side here. And so again, I put it all on one screen so you could see that these slides kind of work together. And so we could go from the biggest biosphere down to an ecosystem, a community in an ecosystem, all the things that live in an ecosystem, a population, and that's specific to the species. We're getting more and more specific. We're getting a smaller thing. And we're also having more similarities as we move down. So organism is the individual living thing. Again, that idea of all the characteristics of living things. Within an organism, you're going to have an organ system, and so maybe that's your circulatory system. An organ, that'd be your heart, so it's made of tissues and it has a specific job. Down from there, we have the cells, and they are the fundamental unit of life. They are one of those things, that cell theory that we'll come back to time and time again. Cells have many bits in them that are called organelles, and as we move through chapter 4, we'll go through all those organelles, and then we get down to the chemical level of organization. And so basically, that's why we do start talking with a little bit of chemistry and then cell biology before we move up. At the end of the course, we do talk about ecosystems and biospheres, but not until the end of the course. And so basically, we work through this course also in a hierarchy of organizational. So this is kind of a buzzword here. I think that sums it all up. They're big words. So they're levels and they are grouped by organization. It's this idea of going from big to small in the hierarchy. And so I kind of think of it as like a triangle. Small down here is the chemistry, that atomic level, and big is all the way up to the biosphere. And you know, all the levels that exist beyond there. All of these, we're talking about another theme, so they kind of intermingle, structure and function. So the way things are built and the jobs that they have. And so again, this is all we can talk about with life and the themes in biology. So the second theme of biology is cell theory. And this is about the third time I've talked about cells. So cells are that fundamental unit of life. They exist in the hierarchy, and they really are that fundamental unit. And so they were up in the characteristics of life as well. All cells have a membrane on the outside that regulates what goes in and what goes out. We call that selective permeability. And as we go into talking about cell biology, we'll talk more about those membranes and how things get in and out. The other thing about all cells is that they have some DNA. They have genetic information in them that helps regulate their life. The other thing is we could talk about the different kinds of cells. So you are a eukaryotic cell. These are backwards, which is terrible. So I'll edit this in future semesters. But so I'm gonna actually just erase that because that's really misleading. So you, I'll switch colors. We'll make it look like I meant to do this. You are a eukaryote. So this is eukaryotic. This is you. Your cells are large and complex. Prokaryotic cells are smaller and more simple. So bacteria is a good example. They're prototypes, if you will. They came before us, and they're smaller, they're older, and they're more simple. So those are the two types of cell, you being a eukaryotic. Plants are also in there with you. And we have some pictures over here. So these would be the larger eukaryotic cells, and these would be the smaller prokaryotic cells, like E. coli, a bacteria. Okay. Hopefully there's no more errors. If we were to talk about more groupings, so not just the kinds of cells, but beyond that, we could talk about how we have 3 domains. And so you're used to hearing about genus and species, like we are Homo sapiens. At the very top, the biggest groups that we could talk about with life are actually domains. And so as we go into taxonomy throughout this course, when we talk about animals and plants, the biggest groups, so these would be the biggest groups of life, are bacteria, and I've already said that they're prokaryotes, and eukarya, so those are all eukaryotic cells, so that would be animals and plants, also some fungi in there, and single-celled and multicellular protists. So when we get into fungi and protists, those are things you probably haven't heard of before. In addition, there is a huge group. Remember, these are the biggest groups. You've heard of bacteria, you've heard of plants and animals, right? And those are eukaryotic cells, but archaea is a whole other huge domain that are prokaryotic. And this is something that's a little bit new, right? New to maybe what you've heard before, but also in this idea of grouping and naming and sorting is one of the first things to learn because we're starting it with the biggest groups. Okay, so the third theme here is form and function, or structure relates to function. So form and function. If you've ever had anything to do with design, and even if that's designing a kitchen or even working in a kitchen, most of us have rented places with terrible kitchens, or the students are actually talking about setting up their own kitchen when they're camping. That's a great opportunity to make form and function work together. So in biology, structure and function, or form and function, the way something's made and the job it does, are closely linked. Evolution is what has shaped these structures because they make sense. Evolution is not goal-based, or you know, there's no underlying goal or direction to it. And so what evolves is what makes sense, and form and function will equal each other or make sense. So we could talk about the shape of molecules and their function, and specifically with proteins, which are enzymes. We could talk about organs in us, like our lungs have a really large surface area because there's so many tiny air sacs, not just two giant balloons. And so that form is a large surface area, and the function would be to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it's made so that it does its job well. And that's what we're talking about with this theme of form and function, or structure relates to function. The other thing is, you can put your hand on your heart. It feels like it's off to the left because the heart itself is asymmetrical. If we take a look at what the left side of the human heart does, it has a thicker wall because it has to pump the blood to the entire body. And so the form would be a thicker muscular wall because of the function is to pump it to the entire body. The right-hand side is thinner, so that's its form, and because its function is only just have to pump to the lungs. And so there's so many examples of form and function, you know, in your house, in your body, in this course, and that'll be a theme that comes back time and time again. Number 4, as far as a theme in biology, is that we interact with our surroundings, and basically we interact with the environment, and we're constantly exchanging matter and energy. So this exchange of matter and energy we could talk about with cycles or energy flows. And so nutrient cycles that you might have heard of before, and probably back in like grade school science, would be the water cycle. Right? Water is continually reused and filters through our environment and is used by animals and plants. Carbon cycles, sometimes we get in there with our composting and adding to the soils in our gardens, right, that the plants are using. Nitrogen cycles, some plants are nitrogen fixers, which makes it available to plants, and some use that nitrogen. Nitrogen is in a lot of fertilizers. So these are all nutrients that cycle through from organism to environment. The other thing that cycles through or flows through is energy. And so if you were to think of it, the sunshine allows the plant to grow. And then we eat that plant and release that energy when we digest it. And so this idea of producers such as plants, so that would be the apple tree, And then over here, consumers such as animals, I'm going to say that's me because that's what I had for lunch was an apple. And so producers and consumers, nutrient cycles and energy cycles or energy flow are really common themes again because all organisms interact with their environment. This one just kind of further classifies or writes what was small on that diagram. So we have producers, consumers, and then we also have decomposers because they're the recyclers. They're big in those nutrient cycles and like I was talking about the composting. The other one that's you don't generally think of as a consumer would be mushrooms and fungi. They also kind of branch into decomposers, but this idea they're not photosynthesizing. All the producers would be photosynthesizing. As the primary example of how they're producing for the ecosystem. Okay, and the fifth one, evolution explains the unity and diversity of life. I love evolution and thinking about things to do with evolution. So at the core of it, in cells, they all have DNA. And DNA is a macromolecule that you will read about when you do your pre-reading for chapter 3. It is a nucleic acid, which is one of the categories of macromolecules, again, that you'll read about in chapter 3. It really is that idea that DNA is our genetic code. And if you were to take a look at DNA, it's really this coding and the differences in DNA that make all the differences of life. So the diversity of life is related to all the differences in DNA sequencing. So the diversity of organisms existing now and over the history and the future of Earth. That's the kind of diversity of life we're talking about. And DNA seemingly has been around for very much of that life on Earth. Really what DNA does is it codes information, and we talk about that as genes, and genes make proteins. So we have DNA ultimately making proteins. So over here you have your genetics, and this would be your appearance or how things work. All right, almost there. If we were to talk about evolution, it's hard to not talk about the father of evolution, Charles Darwin. He had two main points. Basically, he said that all the species that are alive today are descendants of ancestral species. It doesn't mean that we evolved from apes. It means that we had a common ancestor way back in the time. And so that idea of descendants of ancestral species was a key tenet of what Charles Darwin said. The other thing is that mechanism for evolution he talked about as natural selection. And so natural selection, what we're talking about is reproductive fitness, or sometimes called survival of the fittest, which is not always the biggest or the fastest. Sometimes it's the smallest and the sneakiest. And so this natural selection is how evolution happens. And I've alluded to that a little bit. Like I said, it's hard for these themes to not kind of overlap a little bit. As much as Charles Darwin was the father of evolution, he didn't use the words evolution. He called it descent with modification. So your descendants will be different than you is what he was after with that. Evolution is connected to our everyday life. So typically the flu virus evolves, and that's why you get a different flu shot every year. Or they make different flu shots every year. The other thing you could do is talk about antibiotic resistance or pesticide resistance. Basically, you're selecting for the bacteria that aren't killed by the drugs, or the pests, the insects that are not killed by the DDT or whatever it is. And so this is an example that we can see maybe shorter time frame than other examples of evolution, but these are the kind of things that we're talking about. You can also talk about pharmaceuticals or conservation efforts. There's great examples that our evolutionary theory can help contribute to those things. This is a great example of natural selection. And so basically what this is trying to illustrate is that in Europe, this would be pre-industrial revolution. And so previously, I think they were moths in the classic example I know, but these are beetles in your textbook example. Some are light, some are dark. There's a variety of colors. And then with this is the Industrial Revolution. And in Europe, there was soot. The buildings got black. And so now, all of a sudden, those white bugs are going to be eaten more easily and more often. And what's going to result is a darker population of bugs. And so this is the bugs eating, or the birds eating the light ones is natural selection. They're being selected out of the population, leaving the darker individuals. And so, you know, the picture's worthwhile. I put in this example here, moths in the Industrial Revolution. Light had the advantage before, but then after everything got dirty and darker, then the darks had the advantage, and the populations changed as a result. All right, let's just take a look back at that list. I know this is making you dizzy, I'm sure. So we're going to go back to the themes. And if we could just kind of sum them up in a word or two. This one is all about the levels. And so you could talk about a hierarchy. That might be a word that's worth adding to that, right? Those biological organizations. The next one is about the cell. Cell theory, or cell is the fundamental unit of life. That's kind of what the second one's talking about. The third one, its structure relates to function. So you could do function equals form, or form equals function, right? As a smaller bit of wording about that. Fourth one, this idea of cycles and flow, of nutrients and energy. And the last one is evolution, unity and diversity of life. So those are the 5 themes. They do come about time and time again. It's kind of nice to start with an introduction to them, because usually when I teach a biology course, that awareness evolves over time, where this time we're kind of making a point of them right off the bat, and I think that that'll help as you see. So the last few minutes, I'm going to just talk about a little bit of chemistry. So this is moving into chapter 2. So it was a separate set of pre-reading questions, or you found them in chapter 2. Again, with this hierarchy, if we were to go down to the base level of organization, we are down at chemistry, or chemicals are at the base level of the hierarchy. And those chemicals are arranged into higher and higher levels of structural organization, eventually leading to you. So the base level that we could talk about is an element. The element is on the periodic table. So everything on the periodic table, which I put in the package, or you can find on the Moodle site as a document, those are all elements. And so carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, those are all elements. And so you can take a look through that. The back side of it has some pictures where you might recognize different elements. An element can exist as an atom. And so you could talk about an atom of nitrogen, or an atom of oxygen. You're not tested on the periodic table, but it is interesting to look at. And really one of my key goals is to just kind of demystify some of this stuff so you can connect to what you already know and place biology in your life in a meaningful way. So if we're at elements, if we were to combine different elements, that's what makes a compound. And so some compounds you might know is that H2O. It's water, right? So what a compound is 2 or more different elements in a fixed ratio. Water is always 2 parts, or 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. So here's your joke. And it's terrible, so you can fast forward the video. An academic upgrading student goes into the library and asks for a glass of H2O because they want to sound cool. And the cafeteria worker gives them a glass of water. It's like, okay, go back to class, whatever. Nobody thinks you're cool. But the trade student comes in after and says, hey, that was pretty neat. Can I have a glass of H2O too? Well, the cafeteria worker takes them very literally. This is not a grammar lesson. So H2O2 is something entirely different. The cafeteria worker should not give this student H2O2 because that's hydrogen peroxide. and certainly something you wouldn't want to drink like water. So this idea is that they have the same elements in them, but they have a different fixed ratio. They have a different kind of composition, and that composition, that structure, gives them their function. Another example of a compound, and one you might know, is CO2. That's carbon dioxide. You could also have carbon monoxide. And those again are very different things, probably compounds that you've heard about. They're close, but they're very different. Other ones would be sodium chloride or table salt. So this is the elements that are in table salt are sodium and chlorine. And the whole idea here, if we were to talk about structure and function, sodium is a metal that explodes in water. And chlorine is a deadly gas, but chemically combined into NaCl, it's literally something that you can put on your popcorn. And so you don't get a much better example of how on the atomic level or the chemical level, their form and their function are really, really different. And so that's what we're kind of trying to get as the main point here. So most of the compounds in living organisms, if we're talking about the big four elements, would be carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And again, those are all on your periodic table. They are the most common elements in organisms. As an example, DNA or chromosomes, your genetic material has all four of these elements in them. And really, it's the different arrangement of these elements that give the unique properties for each level of compound in an organism. And so again with this, on an atomic and molecular level, structure and function are related. And that's one of the themes that's illustrated as you move into chapter 2. So that's the end of chapter 1 and 2. You can now complete the review pages for those. They're marked out of 10, and I gave you or posted the review page rubric on those. You start with 10 out of 10 and then work from there. Things to think about, complete or on time in 1 week or talk to me. So, we've got a lot of flexibility, but communication is key here. So talk to me if you have any questions as we keep going through this course. Really, when you're doing your review pages, things to think about. Have you made those pages useful to you? Absolutely, copying from the glossary might not be a bad place to start when you're doing the pre-reading, but you can take it a little bit further when you get onto these yellow review pages. And the other thing with the yellow review pages, as much as I mark them out of 10, if you're not happy with them, you could resubmit them and increase your mark, or I assume it's going to increase your mark. One thing I forgot to say, and I'm just going to tack it on the end here, in the pre-reading, you don't have to open the book and start reading the first page of, say, chapter 2. I would suggest using the summary at the end of the chapter, and I did mention that glossary. That's a great place to start as you're trying to navigate that big textbook and make it through the material of this course.